digitaljamsessions.com.
Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we're joined by Amelia from Flex Lounge and we also have with us Graham from Entech. So hello and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having us.
I want to first ask you to briefly introduce yourself and explain what it is that you're up to. I'm going to start with you, Amelia, if you can tell us more about specifically what you're doing at Flex Lounge.
Yeah, sure. I'm Amelia Coleman. I'm the head of innovation at EngageWorks, and part of my job is I get to curate the Flex Innovation Lounges in London and Dubai, which means I get to sort of find the latest emerging technologies and get them all into one room where professionals can come and interact with them and sort of open their minds to the possibilities that they give us now. So recently I've been doing experiments where I measure the emotional data of people as they try virtual reality for the very first time. And my tests have been done on people ages 3 to 80.
Okay. So in other words, you're very much a playground for anybody who enjoys technology.
Yeah. There's so many different new technologies that give us new ways to reach audiences and create experiences that people haven't had before. And I think there's also a bit of a fear factor when it comes to technology and innovation. So what we try and do at Flux is introduce people to these new technologies and get them to get hands-on with it. And once they sort of get over that and realize how exciting these things are, then you can start to pair up new technologies to create something completely new and different.
Wonderful. So Graham, why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing at Entech and this whole new frontier of emotions and emotion mapping?
Absolutely. So Entech, we are building a platform to allow the measurement of and analysis of emotions from facial gestures and expressions using a wearable platform that we have built initially into VR, but also building glasses formats for AR and for medtech applications. And using it, we're able to measure the arousal, engagement, and the emotional output of the wearer in response to given content, allowing us to translate an individual's expressions and emotions directly through into a virtual environment, allowing us to analyze their response to content, or also being able to measure and help improve people's expressions and emotional display, which has a number of medical applications as well. So fundamentally, we're developing a platform that analyzes, recognizes, and measures your emotions.
Okay, cool. So today I wanted to talk a little bit more about what the social impact of VR is going to be, because you've both kind of dabbled in the area of virtual reality. And I am kind of curious to start off with you, Graham, and this kind of future of emotion and capturing emotion and how we see that necessarily kind of translating into these mass social groups of people who are coming together to experience something in an alternate, in a virtual reality environment of some sort. Do we think that this is a kind of a long-term plausibility of being able to translate these emotions that people are having in that moment so that you can have a kind of a face-to-face avatar kind of experience and really see that emotion being translated in the virtual environment?
Absolutely. I don't think it's only possible. I think it's absolutely a necessity. A significant amount of the communication that we have person to person is non-verbal. It's through our hands, it's through our eyes, it's through our facial expressions, it's through our body language and body movement. And without any of those things in a virtual environment, the social connection just doesn't exist in the same way. Voice and voice communication provides a fundamentally important platform for communication, and obviously it does carry emotional content as well. But without that direct person-to-person connection, the social experience will always be empty in VR. And the great promise that it holds as a massively social environment rather than as an isolating environment that people that perhaps don't understand VR sometimes think it is. As a massively social environment, it can only achieve that potential if and when we have the ability to convey our facial expressions and underlying emotions directly through the medium.
Okay. Is that something you see, Amelia, as a possibility in terms of controlling the experience through our facial expressions?
I think that's fascinating. I think it is definitely something that is going to enhance the virtual experience even more. I think virtual reality is going in a way that it's becoming more reflective of human-to-human communication. one of the things that we struggle with in our business is you take something like email and it's completely devoid of emotion and it can be misinterpreted. So then you start to go into things like Skype and you're still missing something. There's still something separating you from that human communication. So what you're talking about, I think, is absolutely essential. I completely agree with that, and really opens up a new level of personal communication.
So the natural next step from where you were talking about in terms of going from an email to a kind of a messenger environment is kind of audio and getting picking up that phone and just literally hearing the emotion in somebody's voice and hearing the tonality of somebody's voice. And I wonder if you would say that there's necessarily a direct correlation in terms of that facial expression that can be conveyed in the same way, or kind of has that same weight, if you like, in terms of the value of sound in a conversation. Definitely. I'm kind of looking at you, Graham.
Yes, our facial expressions convey a vast amount of information in the conversation that actually you may not even consciously realize that you're picking up. We deliver micro expressions, which are characterized as expressions that by Dr. Paul Ekman characterized as expressions that last for no more than 250 milliseconds. These micro expressions actually convey a lot of underlying information about how we really feel about the topic that we're talking about. And people who have emotional intelligence, people who are good at understanding and involving themselves in human-to-human communication, are actually people who are extremely good at reading these micro expressions and reading the underlying emotional intent of the person. And conversely, people who sit on the Asperger's or autistic spectrum are people who are really bad at reading those expressions and understanding the emotional intent of the person that they're talking to.
Or having that lack of awareness.
Yes, absolutely. No, it is a skill, and it is a skill that can be learned, but it is also a skill that some of us, like any skill, some of us are naturally better at it than others.
So I suppose then there's a kind of a curveball here. The concern for some people would be that in these virtual reality environments, there is this kind of almost a similarity in terms of the way that the internet kind of exploded with kind of chat rooms and virtual environments, where people are kind of able to hide behind their avatars or hide behind this, this internet thing that nobody quite knew who the other person was on the other end. So you think you're speaking to some young, slim girl, and actually you're speaking to some old guy from, wherever. Do you think that there is some kind of element of this emotional tracking being able to kind of unmask people in virtual reality and really kind of demonstrate who they really are in some ways?
It's a really interesting question, and a lot of people, when I'm explaining the research and the technologies that we're building, the first question is this a lie detector? Is this a way of recognizing the ultimate truth? And there are circumstances in which it could be used in order to analyze more depth about that individual and what they really mean. But actually, what we're doing is improving the bandwidth of communication. So audio communication with language clearly is the most important thing to get your core message across. But as we've been talking, to get the subtleties of that message across, to get the emotional intent, there is a lot of body language, there's a lot of facial expression, there's a lot of emotional content that goes with that. And by increasing the bandwidth of the internet to cover that emotional content, we are improving our communication. That communication does not have to be delivered as you. So we are not building a face tracker. I'm not intending to put your face on the internet unless you want it to be. Your avatar could be anything. Your avatar could be a 70-year-old man, a 10-year-old girl, a red floating ball that expresses emotions through colours or sounds or vibrations or whatever else. The point is that communication ability is there, that the bandwidth has been increased in order to provide that. So on the internet, it's still the case that no one knows that you're a dog. But you can be a dog that can express itself more clearly.
It feels a little bit like motion capture, almost, in terms of...
Motion capture is about you.
Yeah.
And motion capture is about translating the exact creases of your face and the corners of your mouth and the crinkles of your eyes through into another environment. Even if you modify that so that you go from being a person into being an elf or a hobbit or whatever it might be, it is still it's a direct translation of you. What we are doing is we're reading electrical muscle activity from underneath the skin. We're reading a much deeper truth in terms of the emotions, and we're actually able to read and convey the emotions that you're not displaying quite so clearly, those micro expressions.
But I would argue that some people might not want that, right? That in a virtual world, that a lot of people like the avatar, like being able to hide behind something, and wouldn't necessarily want the subtleties of themselves exposed, like the lie sort of, I don't know.
Sure, and that's why I'm saying your avatar doesn't have to look like you in
not
any
really
way
a representation
whatsoever.
of you.
What we're doing is allowing a deeper level of communication, but we're not asking you to expose yourself. It doesn't have to be you on the internet. You could be anybody else on the internet, but you're able to just express yourself more clearly. We see this if you look at some of the social VR applications that are available now. So if you take Space VR, for example, which is one of the better known ones, they had launched for maybe 3 months before they realized that there was a hard requirement to express emotions, and they needed a way to solve that. So what did they do to solve it? They put emojis in. So you can now be an avatar in their space, and you can have a little happy smiling face above your head. It is the most basic and arguably not terribly clever way to express emotion in a social sharing environment, but it is necessary because it is part of that communication.
It feels like we've gone back to the 90s, the very beginning of how we expressed ourselves on the internet. But I have a question for you, Amelia, and this is kind of going back to what you just said about that kind of whole idea of maybe people don't really want to expose themselves, as who they are on the internet. They want to be able to hide behind the internet. And I am kind of curious from your perspective what your thoughts are in terms of there is clearly some education that will happen as a result of this type of technology. And even the fact that people can be within a virtual environment and share a social experience within a virtual environment. There's an argument to say that due to the kind of technology that we have in society nowadays, that people have become a little bit distant from each other, and there's a disassociation. There's the kind of old adage of you can lie in bed at night with your partner and both of you be staring at separate devices and not actually talking to each other. Or if you look at the typical dinner table now, everybody's eating their dinner and nobody's looking at each other or talking to each other because they're all busy on different devices. And I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of the potential for social VR to kind of take back that kind of personal relationship with other people and to encourage that interpersonal communication.
Yeah, I think one thing that sort of stuck out to me about VR recently is that it's still different personalities embrace different things. Some people embraced the smartphone 10 years ago, some people are just getting their first one now. There's a couple different age groups that I think are going to be highly receptive to this. One, the teenage sort of social aspect, you could be doing your homework and still hanging out with your friends. I see that as a really obvious one. I think Facebook's nailed that. But one that struck me recently is it's being trialed and used in homes for the elderly and people who are lonely and maybe live on their own, giving them a way to be social without having to have that mobility is, I think, a really empowering thing that could, to quote Sims, give someone a second life, you know? And I think that's an interesting way to go. But at the same time, one of the kids that I did the virtual reality thing for, he was unimpressed. He wasn't interested, and he'd rather play with the robot and have a conversation, and he didn't want to be in a virtual world. And so it's very sort of personality based too. It's not a sort of a one fit for everyone. And I see it very much as like another platform. So we have our phones, we have VR, we have iPads, we have, a wearable, and it's one of those things that slots into our life, in the specific way that we want to use it. I don't think it's going to ever usurp one-to-one human communication.
Glad to hear that. There were some people who would have us believe it will completely take over everybody's life. And in fact, earlier on today, at a different event, somebody mentioned that the idea of a future where we end up just literally coming to the end of our lives and laying in some kind of a pod with a virtual reality device on and living the kind of last part of our lives in virtual reality, so to speak.
Well, picture the Matrix.
Yes. that was actually the phrase that was thrown in is what if we end up living in the Matrix? And I am kind of curious though, do you feel that there is a potential here for the idea that we become dependent on not necessarily specifically virtual reality, but these immersive technologies, that we end up becoming dependent on them in the same way that people are dependent on their smartphone nowadays? If you said to somebody, hey, go find a place and I'm going to take your smartphone off you, don't have Google Maps anymore, and certainly the younger folk would look at you and kind of go, what?
Yeah.
And I'm curious, do you think we're going to get to that stage with immersive tech where it becomes that thing that's so integral in our lives that there's an assumption that we'll always have the tech available to us?
I think my personal view is I agree with Amelia completely that it will find niches, and those niches may not be those that are immediately apparent to us, but they will appeal to particular people for particular reasons, particular age groups in engaging in whatever. And gaming and social, to me, look like the obvious two areas. I think the question of whether immersion becomes the primary mechanism for communication is a tough one. As we look forward towards augmentation rather than immersion, then I think the probability that it will become a fundamental part of our day-to-day lives and become you gave the example of Google Maps, and I can see augmented reality and use of augmentation being exactly the same as our use of the phone and Google Maps as we're wandering the streets at the moment, and more so. The opportunities and the possibilities there are huge.
I'm still waiting for somebody to create some kind of augmented reality device that just pops up people's LinkedIn so I know who somebody is.
Absolutely. Just reminds me what the name is. That would be a good starting point.
Just tell me who they are. Who's this person? What's your thoughts on that, though?
Well, I agree that mixed reality is really going to change sort of the interface of computers, and it could make computers absolutely obsolete. So I'm a big believer in mixed reality with virtual reality. Yeah, I think there's in some ways. So what immediately made me think is catfish. You know how people have this like internet relationship and they text message each other and they've never met each other and they've never Skyped with each other. So if you take that and just put it into a virtual world, you could fall in love with an avatar and become dependent on it and make that your social life. I can see that.
Do you think we're getting closer to that future that we saw in the film Her? Where we see kind of people falling in love with their operating systems or their computing AI?
I think that the underlying technologies that lead us towards that possibility are now an evident truth in our society. The tech companies are now all falling over themselves to rebrand themselves as AI businesses.
Indeed.
And emotional awareness and emotional intelligence in computing, which is artificial intelligence for most of the applications we're talking about, is now the driving force, not just a backseat research project, but the driving force amongst many of the companies. And we've seen Amazon Echo come out this week, seeing new versions of Siri, where Apple, Amazon, Google have all bought companies that allow them to start doing analysis of voice tone in order to understand intent and not just words.
Yes.
And just as we've been talking about facial expressions, the way that we deliver words and the emotions that we put into them, the focus that we put on words makes a big difference to the meaning of the sentence. And that next level of effective computing that allows the computing system to understand the real intent of the user is the next big wave of technology. We are now in the age of emotion. We have left the information age, in my view.
So perhaps potential explosion in terms of linguistics and conlang and all those kind of areas.
We're going to see a huge growth in all of this in the next few years.
Okay.
I think it's really interesting how AI is starting to learn people's preferences and anticipate. I think the anticipation by AI to serve your needs and your interests and your wants is quite exciting, but also quite scary, because if you have these AIs in your life who are giving you everything you want and anticipating your needs and making you feel good about yourself or that kind of thing, it does change the relationship you have maybe with real humans. You might some people might feel more comfortable with an AI that's going to
I think it personalizes the computing experience.
I think it very much depends on the function as well of that artificial intelligence. So for example, I'm going to give a shout out now to Amy and X.AI. Yes, Dennis, hi. So I have Amy in my life, and Amy is an artificial intelligence, and she schedules all my meetings for me, and I never have to deal with somebody if they want to have a meeting with me. But people who know me now understand that will be the case, and that they aren't dealing with a human, they're dealing with an artificial intelligence, and she's reasonably smart. And as long as they don't try and deliberately, go too far outside the bounds of what she can cope with, everybody's happy. It works for everybody involved. And I think that it is a case of having that familiarity in our lives, of being able to handle the technology, because it is almost like we just have to tweak the way that we speak, the way that we articulate ourselves, just ever so slightly, so that the artificial intelligence can understand that and can, then do what it needs to do. But I think you're right, Graham, in as much as we move forward, we're going to be seeing more and more modification in terms of understanding people's intent and the way that we articulate ourselves and the dynamics of the way that we talk, so that we don't have to adjust the way that we speak, and we don't have to adjust to an artificial kind of, format in the way that we convey things. I am curious though, what you think is going to be that big shift, that big change beyond this kind of, linguistics and language piece that you think is going to need to happen in the next 5 to 10 years that will completely change the way that you do business. And I know that's kind of a very ambitious question, given that you're already kind of very much on the front edge when it comes to what you're both doing. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. And I'm going to start with you, Graham, because you look less perplexed than Amelia does.
I think I'm quite perplexed. So I'm spending my life on the bleeding edge here. So asking me to look even beyond that is
blue sky, big blue
is
sky.
asking for something. Well, so I will talk about what I do see coming rather than what might come beyond that. And I think that this maybe isn't the greatest of new news, but the driverless car revolution is going to change the face of computing as we know it. It is already doing that, but we haven't seen the outcome of it yet. But as we take on a device which will literally be responsible for keeping us alive as we're in transport, the dependence on computing and our ability to interact and relate to the technology that is driving that has to go through a fundamental shift. And that is where artificial intelligence really works or doesn't. It's not about whether the AI makes the perfect decision about the route to take, how fast to go, how far it stays behind the car in front, and all the other things which are critical to health and safety. It's how it handles the fact that it has human occupants and how it reacts with us in order to give us the trust in order to be part of this technology that will have a knock-on effect to the way that we use technology in every other part of our lives as well.
It's interesting that you bring this up though, because there were some questions around this whole kind of autonomous vehicle future. And so first of all, I am looking forward to having autonomous vehicles in our lives. Within my lifetime, I will never need to learn how to drive, and I am absolutely stoked for the fact I will never need to learn how to drive. But there was a debate that was had previously around this idea, as you say, of the AI kind of having the ultimate responsibility in terms of human life. And at what stage, because it will happen at some point, there will be, an incident of some sort where that AI has to make the decision between who is worth saving in a scenario where there are maybe 2 vehicles about to impact, and there are, X number of people in one vehicle, X number of people in the other vehicle. Who is the person that needs to be saved in that scenario? And is it the AI's responsibility to necessarily make that decision? And should we be placing those kind of decisions in the hands of an AI? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. Both
that's huge. Yeah.
Well, as a technologist and somebody who has been studying artificial intelligence for my entire adult life and building software for my whole life, I do tend to think of that question as really one that commentators love to analyse, but one that actually doesn't really have the practical application that you think it has. When you actually boil down the components that lead to a multiple life or death situation, do you save the people in car A, car B, etc., that there are almost undoubtedly things that would be done along the way that don't lead to a position where everybody's going to die, or otherwise everybody's just going to die. When at some point there is always a complete systems failure where beyond nothing else will happen whatsoever. But I don't believe actually that there is a choice to be made. I'd be interested to find out how many times actually a human being has made that choice. And I think that might be telling in terms of what the import of that question really is in practical terms. It is a really interesting ethical, theoretical question.
But you could argue that AI is actually more qualified to make that decision because it takes it out of emotional context and social context, and it's factual based and practical based. I mean, I know AI is going into becoming creative in things, but it doesn't. In a way, I'd almost rather have an AI make that decision than make a personal decision like that and have that on my conscience.
Yeah, just very quick. When you're talking about the real world, you're talking about a very large number of variables in this situation. So you've got 2 cars heading towards each other at slightly unknown speeds, where you don't know what the frictional impact is going to be. You don't know what will happen when one car is 250 kilos heavier than the other car, and all the other things that you cannot work out in a split second. So you do not know what the
what the
definite
possible
impact,
outcomes
what
could have been.
the definite outcomes will be.
Yes.
What you can do is build a probabilistic outcome, and the AI would choose the one that had the highest probability of everybody surviving, but people might die in the process.
But the interesting thing is that I don't think that the question is necessarily a technical question, in as much as I think you're kind of right, Amelia, in as much as there's a certain degree of just it's logic. But I think it's actually more the emotional response to, people who throw that question out and worry about the idea that lives are at stake and they are in the hands of machinery. It's kind of like back in the 80s and the 90s when we had this whole spout of sci-fi films where it was always, technology is the bad guy, Terminators are gonna, destroy us all, or whatever the technology is gonna basically take over mankind. And if we leave decisions in the hands of technology, ultimately it will be bad for humanity. And I think there is a certain degree of kind of emotional reticence for people to want to necessarily let go of the control and want to necessarily give that up. So I do think that maybe that's part of the reason why so many people love throwing that question out there.
Yes, what it comes down to is really a fear of the unknown and this sense that we're always better if we're in control, whereas actually there are so many areas of our life when we do trust what the computer tells us, and you're postulating another, a more extreme example of the same. I think that there's a little bit of the if man were meant to fly, God would have given us wings kind of thinking to that. When we get to that point, there will have been deaths in cars which have been autonomously driven at the time. In fact, there obviously has been already, but there will have been far, far fewer of them than there would have been if the people had been driving those cars.
Absolutely. So, Amelia, I'm curious, from your perspective, what you think is going to be that big, significant change that needs to happen in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah.
That's going to change the way you do business.
Well, I have a couple. I mean, data is changing everything we do at the moment. Sort of everything's getting more interconnected, and we're producing all this data, and how it's being interpreted and analyzed. I mean, one of the questions I have for you, Graham, that we can talk about later is where does all that data of the emotionals go? Does the person who created those emotions, do they own the data? Who owns the data? And then there's sort of using data to generate virtual worlds, and then using mind control technology or mind activation technology to start to create worlds in mixed reality, virtual reality, and where that actually leads us. We are looking at a future where we are creating experiences and emotional states and interaction that has never existed before. So I think around all these areas, there's going to have to be a lot of thought. Like in robotics, sort of the 3 rules of robotics, that a robot can never harm you, or you should never do that. I think there's going to have to be rules around that for virtual reality, mixed reality. I see a lot of different areas where we're starting to come to these sort of social climaxes where we need to start putting some guidelines or some social rules around things before it could kind of spiral out of control and become a future movie, And then also, I think another big one is people augmenting their minds and their bodies. We talked about the HoloLens, I'm kind of obsessed with it at the moment, but, you have these augmented reality things pop up and these holograms in your life, and then what's stopping people from, doing an implementation? So it becomes something that you can turn on and off, and you can have it, and you don't need a device necessarily. I think people, this is something that's happening. I mean, people are working on this stuff right now, and I think that's going to be really game-changing eventually. And again, we're going to need to come up to some consensus of how we use this and not destroy ourselves.
Okay. As always, we like to give our listeners a way to be able to find out a little bit more about what you're up to and follow you. So if you would be so kind as to share with us your social media handle of choice. I'll start with you, Amelia.
Sure. I'm at Miss Amelia _K.
Thank you. Okay.
And our Twitter handle is at MTech Inc., which is EMTEQINC.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to subscribe and review. We'd like to thank the Digital Catapult for hosting us today for this Digital Jam session, and thank you once again for joining us. DigitalJamSessions.com